So today, Steve, I'd like to talk about the selection of primary and secondary objectives. The objectives of the study address the broad question posed by the scientific goal of the research, and then the endpoints or the outcomes are the quantitative measurements required to address these objectives.
Hi, Shawnee. Yeah, I think a great example might be the overall objective of a study might be to look for a reduction in blood pressure, with the specific endpoint being something like, say, the change in the systolic blood pressure over 12 weeks, so much more specific.
We know then that objectives are classified into three groups. So we have primary, secondary, and exploratory objectives. Primary and secondary objectives should be pre-specified, meaning that they are determined before the start of the study. And then we have a little bit more flexibility with exploratory objectives in terms of the level of detail in which they need to be predefined. So if we focus on the primary objective for a moment, so that's our measure of greatest importance from a regulatory perspective. So most studies have just one primary objective. However, we may have more than one, isn't that right?
Yeah, so there's always more leeway provided, I think, for exploratory studies in terms of the number and positioning of these objectives and these outcomes in our studies. However, by the time we've reached the pivotal or confirmatory trials, the study must typically be powered using that primary objective. So the sample size that we determine should have sufficient statistical power to detect the effect of the product on the primary objective, and it must also account for the possibility of dropouts based on past experience.
So then going back to studies with more than one primary, from a regulatory perspective, I suppose we know it is best practice to have just a single primary objective. However, we also know that there may be more than one. And in these cases, it's important to consider if the objectives will be treated as co-primary or multiple primary objectives. And in the case of multiple objectives, it is then important to make a statistical adjustment for multiplicity.
Yeah, this whole statistical topic, Shawnee, I think has become a major influence on EFSA opinions in the last 5 years or so. And, you know, the handling of statistics and this issue of handling of multiplicity is now frequently cited in EFSA's published opinions on health claims. So I think you and I are going to get into this subject a bit more in one of our next videos because it's such a big deal. So we haven't really talked about secondary objectives yet, Shawnee.
Yes, so secondary objectives, on the other hand, have less of an impact from a regulatory perspective than the primary objective does. But they also need to be part of a pre-specified analysis plan for evaluating the effect of the product.
Yeah, I think if I go back to that example of a blood pressure study that I was talking about at the start of this video, change in systolic blood pressure might be your primary outcome for a study, but you might well have change in diastolic blood pressure as a secondary outcome, because together they'll help to overall evaluate the overall change in blood pressure and prove that it's beneficial, but you still have systolic blood pressure as your primary.
It's important to note that the number of secondary objectives should be limited, because a study conducted after the initial exploratory phase of development can be criticised for having too many secondary endpoints. Is this something that you've come across in the past?
Absolutely. I had a great experience of talking to EFSA's NDA panel on one of these post-adoption teleconferences, where members of the panel made it very clear that a study which had 18 secondary endpoints was just not credible. You know, there was some laughter at the possibility that it could have that many endpoints. So I think often we should give consideration to whether some of the secondary endpoints are better placed as exploratory, because you have much more leeway with these exploratory endpoints, particularly if the focus of the exploratory ones is generating a new hypothesis.
Well, 18 endpoints. I don't envy the person who had to write up that clinical study report. Exploratory objectives or exploratory endpoints may often include physiological biomarkers that may not necessarily show a treatment effect, but they support a potential mode of action for the product. Do EFSA provide any, I suppose, guidance or outline of appropriate endpoints?
Yeah, there are 6 published guidance documents on the scientific requirements for these health claims, which they outline the acceptable clinical and biomarker outcomes for substantiations of claims. Reactive to the submissions that have occurred since 2007 around the health claim space, so necessarily some of them are more useful than others, and also some of them have been updated since that time, whereas others are still all dated from 2012. But nevertheless, they form a great starting point for somewhere to look at your selection of endpoints for trials.
So I think we both agree that it's important to give clear thought to the selection of primary and secondary objectives in advance, not only, as we said, to ensure appropriate study design, but also to set yourself up for well-defined statistical analysis. And I think this is something that we'll probably get into in a lot more detail in our next video.
Absolutely. Sometimes less is more, and I think having a neatly defined set of primary and secondary outcomes is very important for the success of your studies.